Have you ever woken up, heart pounding, unable to tell if what you just experienced was real or simply a creation of your own mind? This is the story of how I, Silas Greyson, a historian whose work often takes me to the darkest corners of forgotten history, found myself trapped in a nightmare that blurred the boundaries between dream and reality. It all began on a night like any other, yet something felt different, as if a cold breeze had swept through my room, carrying with it the whispers of something far away. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and for a moment, I could swear I saw the shadows on the walls move, shifting in ways that they shouldn't. That night, I closed my eyes, and as soon as sleep took hold, I found myself in a place I had never been before, a vast field, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The sky above was a dull, crimson shade, and the horizon seemed to pulse with an unnatural glow, as if distant fires were raging just out of sight. The ground beneath my feet felt dry, brittle, and with each step, it cracked like ancient bones. There was a sense of familiarity, an inexplicable feeling that I had been there before, though I knew that was impossible. This place was like a memory dredged up from a past I could not remember, one filled with a sense of dread that gripped my chest. The smell hit me next, burning wood, mixed with something foul, something that twisted my stomach. It was the stench of decay, of something once living that had been scorched until only ash and despair remained. In the distance, I could hear a faint crackling, almost like laughter, hidden within the shifting winds. There was something profoundly wrong here, and I felt it in every fiber of my being, a gnawing terror that seemed to rise from the very earth. It was as if the field itself was alive, aware, and it had noticed me. It was watching. My instinct screamed at me to wake up, to escape this dream before it swallowed me whole, but I couldn't. It was as if my body was frozen in place, compelled to move forward despite the fear coursing through my veins. I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart pounding against my ribcage as the shadows in the field began to shift. Shapes emerged, indistinct but undeniably there, lurking at the edge of my vision. When I tried to focus on them, they would melt back into the dark, but I knew they were following me. I was not alone, and whatever was out there, it wanted me to keep going. In that moment, I realized the true terror of this place. It was not just a dream. It was a trap, a twisted reflection of something real, something that existed beyond the safety of my conscious mind. The shadows, the smells, the eerie familiarity, they were all too vivid, too visceral to be mere figments of imagination. It felt as though I had crossed a threshold, entered a space between worlds where the boundaries of reality frayed and dissolved. And I could sense, deep in my gut, that whatever I found at the end of this path would not let me return unchanged. Before we continue, before I tell you what I saw when I reached the heart of that nightmare, I want to ask you something. Do you believe that dreams can be more than just the wandering of an unconscious mind? That perhaps, under the right conditions, they can be doors to something far darker, something waiting for us on the other side? If you're curious to find out, if you dare to step with me into the unknown, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Because what I'm about to share with you is not just a story, it is a warning, a glimpse into a world that none of us are truly prepared to face. The lines between the real and the imaginary are thinner than you think, and sometimes they shatter when we least expect it. It began like any ordinary dream, or at least that's what I told myself. But there was something about it that was too vivid, too consuming, as if I'd slipped not into a dream, but into another reality entirely. I found myself standing in a desolate field that stretched endlessly in every direction. The ground beneath me was a patchwork of dead grass and blackened earth, cracked as if it hadn't seen rain in decades. The sky above was a deep, bruised crimson, with swirling clouds that seemed to writhe like something alive, obscuring whatever lay beyond. The wind blew in sudden, erratic gusts, carrying with it the acrid stench of burning. Wood, yes, but also something else, something that clung to the back of my throat and twisted my stomach in knots. In the distance, I could make out shapes, dark silhouettes against the crimson sky, like trees but wrong, twisted in angles that defied nature. As I moved closer, the ground crunched beneath my feet, dry and brittle like charred bones. Each step was accompanied by a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the air, like something, or someone, was listening, waiting for me to draw nearer. The atmosphere pressed down on me, growing heavier with each step, and I felt as if I were being swallowed by the very landscape. There was a sense that the field was not just an environment, but a presence, ancient and aware, and it had marked my arrival. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper, soft at first, carried on the wind, but unmistakably there. It was a voice neither male nor female, but something in between, an inhuman sound that made my skin crawl. It called my name, Silas, like a lover's murmur, intimate and unsettling. I turned, my breath hitching, but no one was there, only the field, silent and watching. The whisper returned louder now, from another direction, and as I twisted to find its source, I realized with dawning horror that the voice was not coming from a person, but from the ground beneath my feet. The earth itself seemed to be speaking to me, the blackened soil vibrating with each syllable, and I could feel the vibrations rising through my legs, cold and unnatural. Ahead, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement. As I squinted, I realized it was a door, standing alone in the middle of the field. It was tall, impossibly tall, its wood blackened and scarred as if it had withstood countless fires. The door was slightly ajar, and from the gap came a soft, orange glow, like a fire smoldering just beyond the threshold. I knew deep down that I should not approach it, that whatever lay behind that door was not meant to be seen. But my feet moved of their own accord, drawn forward by an unseen force. Each step brought a rising dread, a pressure that built in my chest until I could barely breathe. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, repeating my name over and over, until it felt like my skull would split open from the noise. As I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the charred wood. The air around me seemed to thrum with anticipation, as if the entire field were holding its breath, waiting for me to make my choice. I pushed the door open, and what I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. It was the same field, but twisted, burning. Flames erupted from the ground, licking at the sky, and the shapes I had seen before were now fully visible. They were not trees. They were figures, people, burning but not consumed, their faces turned toward me, mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were hollow, empty voids, and yet I felt their gaze on me, their despair and hatred reaching across the burning field to wrap around my heart. The heat was unbearable, the flames alive, writhing like serpents, moving towards me as if they had a will of their own. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the brittle ground, and I fell hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there, staring up at the swirling, blood-red sky, the whispers now a deafening chorus of screams. I wanted to wake up. I needed to wake up, but there was no escape, no way to pull myself free from this nightmare. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the ground, and I was left alone, surrounded by flames that seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if they were alive, feeding on my fear. I could feel the heat closing in, the air turning to fire in my lungs, and as the world around me began to blur, I saw something, a shadow moving through the flames, coming closer. It was a figure, tall and dark, with eyes that burned like embers. It reached out towards me, and I felt a coldness, a darkness that swallowed the fire, and then nothing. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if it would burst. The room was dark, the shadows long and deep, and in the silence, I could still hear the whispers, faint but there, calling my name. I looked at the clock, 3:33 a.m., and in that moment, I knew this was not over. The field had marked me, and whatever waited there was not finished with me yet. After that night, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me from the dream. It lingered in the corners of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the burning field, the door standing alone, and the figures twisted in flame. I tried to tell myself it was only a nightmare, but it felt so real, as if I had truly been there. Days passed, and the sense of dread grew stronger. I started noticing things, small, almost insignificant at first, but undeniably strange. Objects in my house seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, moving just slightly out of place, like the walls themselves had begun to play tricks on me. One morning, I found ash on my bedroom floor, a fine, black powder that seemed to have no source. It was scattered near my bed, as if something had stood there while I slept, watching. My skin prickled with an icy fear that refused to leave. At night, I heard noises, soft, whispering sounds that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as if the whispers from the dream had slipped through some unseen crack in reality and now haunted my waking hours. My heart would pound in the darkness, and I'd hold my breath, straining to hear, terrified that if I listened too closely, I might understand what they were saying. I became obsessed with the dream, trying to make sense of the symbols, the strange door, and the burning field. I spent hours combing through old books and forgotten documents, searching for anything that could explain what I had experienced. Late one night, while flipping through a dusty tome of local folklore, I found a reference, a vague mention of a cursed place known as the Burning Field, where those who entered never returned the same. It was said that the land was haunted, that a tragedy had occurred there long ago, and that the spirits of the dead lingered, trapped in eternal flames. My blood ran cold as I read the words, a chill creeping down my spine. It was the exact field from my dream. Determined to understand, I continued reading, each page revealing more of the dark history of that place. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that what I had seen was not merely a nightmare, but a glimpse into something far older, something dark and twisted that refused to stay buried. The story spoke of figures seen in the flames, of whispers that lured people deeper into the field, of a door that appeared only to those who were marked. A door that once opened could never be fully closed. I felt my heart pound harder with every word, the terror of the dream resurfacing, now mixed with the grim realization that it might have been real. One night, as I sat in my study, surrounded by old books and the dim glow of a flickering lamp, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the wall, even though there was no source of light to cast it. I turned quickly, my pulse racing, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, silent and still. But then I heard it again, a whisper, soft and faint, coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I stood, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to run, but my feet carried me forward, driven by a compulsion I couldn't understand. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow under the door at the far end. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, like voices just on the edge of comprehension. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, my skin prickling with the sense that I was not alone. Slowly, I pushed the door open, and my heart skipped a beat. There, in the center of the room, was something that shouldn't have been possible. The blackened door from my dream, standing upright, its surface scarred and burnt. A faint, orange glow seeped from the gap, and the air around me grew thick with the acrid smell of smoke. My legs felt weak, my body frozen with terror, but I couldn't look away. The door seemed to pulse, as if alive, and I could hear the whispers now louder, almost deafening. They were calling my name again, urging me to come closer, to step through. My head spun, the room seeming to tilt around me, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I realized the truth. The door had found me. Whatever I had seen in the dream, whatever darkness had marked me, it had followed me back, and now it wanted me to return. The flames, the figures, the endless field, they were all waiting on the other side, and they would not be denied. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, closing in around me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat, and my legs refused to move. The whispers grew louder still, the voices overlapping, until they became a roar, and I knew that if I opened that door, if I took even one step closer, there would be no coming back. The terror was overwhelming, a primal fear that gripped me completely, and in that moment, I understood. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun, and whatever waited beyond that door was not finished with me yet. The door seemed to pulse with life, its darkened surface emanating an unnatural heat. My hand hovered in the air, fingers trembling, and I felt a strange force drawing me in. It wasn't curiosity that drove me. It was something else, something darker. I tried to pull away, to step back, but my feet fell rooted to the ground. My heart pounded as I heard the whispers again, now coming from the very wood of the door, their voices like 1,000 murmurs overlapping, rising in a chaotic symphony that filled my ears and my mind. I could barely make out my name, woven through the cacophony, as if they were calling me home. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was not what I had expected. It wasn't the hallway of my home anymore. It was a field, burning, endless, alive. Flames danced along the ground, twisting and curling as if they had a mind of their own, and the sky above was an unnatural black, thick with smoke and something else, a darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe, as if it were watching me. My mouth went dry, a deep, primal fear overtaking every rational thought. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, filled with the scent of charred earth and something sickly sweet that made my stomach churn. At the center of the field, where the flames burned brightest, I saw it, a scarecrow, its body made of old, weathered wood and tattered cloth, its face an empty void beneath a broad-brimmed hat. It stood tall and imposing, and yet there was something terribly wrong with it. It didn't move, yet I could feel its attention on me, a dark awareness that seemed to reach out from the hollow where its eyes should have been. I wanted to look away to run, but my gaze was locked onto it, drawn to the symbol carved into its chest, a twisted rune that seemed to writhe and shift as I stared, a mark I knew all too well from my readings. Suddenly, the scarecrow moved. Its head turned with a slow, creaking motion, and I could see the darkness of its face expanding, a deep void that seemed to swallow the light of the flames around it. My breath caught in my throat as the whispers grew louder, now coming from the scarecrow itself, a guttural chant that reverberated through the air. I tried to scream, to make any sound at all, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. I could feel the ground beneath me begin to tremble, the dry, brittle earth cracking as if something beneath it was trying to claw its way to the surface. And then everything shifted. The flames surged, rising higher, and the scarecrow's form began to change. Its body twisted and elongated, the cloth turning to ash and falling away, revealing something dark and pulsing beneath, something alive. Its face, once empty, now bore two deep voids where eyes should have been, staring directly into mine, and I felt a coldness spread through me, an emptiness that seemed to pull me in. I knew, without a doubt, that this was not just a scarecrow. It was something far older, something born of fire and shadow, something that had waited for me. Panic set in, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, my feet glued to the earth, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The scarecrow raised one of its arms, the wood creaking and splintering as it moved, and pointed towards me. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and I felt the ground beneath me give way. I was falling, the earth crumbling, the flames consuming everything around me, and the last thing I saw before darkness took me was the scarecrow's empty face, the void where its eyes should have been, and the realization that it had found me. It had chosen me. In an instant, I was back in my bed, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat, my hands clutching the sheets so tightly that my knuckles were white. My heart pounded in my ears, and I looked around, disoriented, the shadows of my room seeming to shift and dance in the dim light. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but the fear, the cold dread that had gripped me, was still there, heavy in my chest. And then I noticed it, the clock beside my bed, glowing in the darkness. 3:33 a.m., the exact same time as before. And then I heard it, the faint crackling of fire, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the room. My breath caught, and I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows. And there, in the corner of my room, I saw it, a figure, dark and still, its eyes empty voids that stared back at me, unblinking. The scarecrow had followed me, crossed the boundary between dream and reality, and it was here, in my room, watching. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days that followed left me in a constant state of unease, the line between dream and waking life blurring to the point where I wasn't sure what was real anymore. It wasn't just the images of the burning field or the scarecrow that haunted me. It was the sensation that I was never alone. Every corner I turned, every room I entered, I felt watched. My house, once a place of refuge, had become a labyrinth of shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something lurked just beyond my vision, slipping away each time I tried to focus on it. And then there were the whispers. At first, I only heard them at night, faint murmurs from the corners of my room, but soon they were there even in broad daylight, echoing from the walls, whispering my name. I began researching obsessively, desperate to understand what was happening to me. I scoured books on folklore, ancient rituals, anything that might explain the burning field, the scarecrow, the door. Days turned into nights as I pored over dusty tomes, looking for some answer, some connection. I barely slept, my nights plagued by visions of flames and hollow-eyed figures, and when I did sleep, it was only to find myself back in that field, the fire closer each time, the scarecrow's empty gaze following me. I knew deep down that this was more than a dream, that somehow I had opened a door that was never meant to be opened. One evening, I stumbled upon something, a mention of an old legend called the Field of the Burned. It was a tale told in whispers, a story that had been largely forgotten, but its details struck a chord deep within me. The legend spoke of a place that had once been the site of an unspeakable tragedy, a field where a fire had raged centuries ago, consuming everything in its path. The villagers claimed that it was no ordinary fire, that it had a life of its own, and that those caught in its flames never truly died. Instead, their spirits became bound to the field, trapped in eternal agony, their cries echoing on the wind, forever calling for help. The more I read, the clearer it became that this field was the very same one I had seen in my dreams. The descriptions matched perfectly: the scorched earth, the twisted figures, the unnatural flames. But what struck me most was the mention of a door, a blackened door that appeared to those who had been marked by the field. The legend claimed that the door was a gateway, a portal that connected the living world to the realm of the lost, and that once opened, it could never be closed. The people who entered the field were said to be drawn by the whispers, called to join the spirits in their endless torment. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I read those words, and I felt my heart begin to pound. I remembered the door from my dream, standing alone in the middle of the field, its surface scarred and burnt. I remembered how it had seemed to call to me, how I had felt an inexplicable compulsion to open it. And I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that I had been marked, that whatever haunted the field had reached out and touched me, had found a way into my mind. The whispers, the shadows, the scarecrow, they were all signs, warnings that something far worse was coming. Determined to understand more, I reached out to the local historical society, hoping to find records of the field and its dark past. It took days of searching, but eventually, I found an old newspaper article, yellowed with age and nearly forgotten in the archives. It spoke of a fire that had swept through a small settlement on the outskirts of town over a century ago, leaving nothing but ash and ruin in its wake. The article described how the survivors had spoken of strange occurrences, of shadows moving in the flames, of a figure that watched from the center of the blaze, a scarecrow that seemed to come alive. I could feel the fear tightening in my chest as I read, each word confirming my worst suspicions. This was the place from my dream, the place that had somehow reached out to me across time and space. I read about how, in the aftermath, Those who had survived began disappearing one by one, drawn back to the burned land, as if they couldn't escape its grasp. The legend claimed that the field called to those it had touched, that once marked, there was no way to escape its pull. And I knew, with a sinking feeling, that this was what was happening to me. The field had marked me, and it was calling me back. That night, I sat in the darkness of my study, the old newspaper clippings spread out before me, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers had grown louder, no longer just faint murmurs in the corners of my mind. They were insistent, demanding, urging me to return to the field. And then, I saw it, a shadow moving across the wall, shifting and twisting, growing larger until it seemed to fill the room. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and there, in the dim light, I saw it. The scarecrow, its hollow eyes staring back at me, its form flickering like a flame. The air grew cold, and I could feel the darkness pressing in around me, the whispers now a deafening roar. My hands shook as I reached for the lantern on my desk, desperate to banish the shadows, to prove to myself that it wasn't real. But as the light flickered to life, the scarecrow was gone, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and the realization that there was no escaping this. The field wanted me, and it would not rest until I returned. I was no longer safe, not in my home, not in my own mind. The boundary between dream and reality had shattered, and whatever waited for me in the burning field was growing stronger. It was only a matter of time before I would have to face it again. Only this time, I knew there would be no waking up, no escaping the flames. The field had claimed me, and soon I would have no choice but to return. The whispers became impossible to ignore. Every waking moment, they were there, gnawing at the edges of my mind like a festering wound that refused to heal. It wasn't just the noise. They carried meaning now, fragments of sentences, strange words that I couldn't understand, but that somehow filled me with a profound sense of dread. I had to go back to the field. I didn't know why, only that it was no longer a choice. The pull was stronger than my fear, stronger than my reason, and it led me, almost like a puppet, to the place where it all began. The field was far out on the edge of town, past forgotten roads, and into the depths of lands that few dared to visit. As I approached, the landscape seemed to shift, growing darker and more twisted, as if the very earth had been tainted by the curse that lingered there. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and a strange silence hung in the air, a silence that seemed to press against my ears, blocking out all other sound. My heart pounded as I parked my car at the edge of the field, the charred remnants of old wooden posts marking the boundary between the world I knew and whatever lay beyond. Stepping out of the car, I was immediately hit by the familiar scent, burnt earth, ash, and something else, something sour and decayed. It was the same smell from my dream, a reminder that I had been here before, though not in body. The ground was as I remembered, dry and brittle, cracking under my feet as I took hesitant steps forward. My skin prickled, a cold chill spreading through me despite the heavy, suffocating air. The sense of being watched was stronger than ever, and I could feel eyes on me, unseen and relentless, lurking in the shadows of the field. As I walked deeper, a figure emerged from the haze, a person, standing motionless. My breath caught in my throat, and I stopped, my body tensing. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with a haunted look that mirrored my own. She stepped forward, and I could see her trembling hands, her lips parting as if to speak. "You heard them too, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. "The whispers, they never stop. They won't let us go." I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. She looked familiar, and then I remembered. Eliza. I had read her name in one of the old newspaper clippings, a local who had disappeared years ago, lost to the field, never to be seen again. And yet here she was, drawn back just like me, her eyes hollow and filled with a terror that struck deep into my core. "They're waiting," she said, her voice cracking. "They want us to see, to remember." She turned, gesturing for me to follow, and I felt my body move almost involuntarily, my feet carrying me further into the heart of the field. The ground beneath us seemed to pulse, like a living thing, and the air grew thick with smoke, the acrid scent burning my throat. The deeper we went, the more twisted the landscape became. Shapes that once resembled trees were now dark and skeletal, their branches reaching out like bony fingers, and the sky above seemed to swirl, the clouds forming shapes that flickered like faces in agony. We came to a clearing, and there, at its center, stood the scarecrow. It was exactly as I remembered, tall, imposing, its face hidden beneath the wide-brimmed hat, the carved rune glowing faintly on its chest. But now, in the dim light of the overcast sky, it seemed more alive, the shadows around it shifting and writhing as if it were breathing. Eliza stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the scarecrow, and I could see tears streaming down her face. "They say if you look into its eyes," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you can see what it saw the night of the fire, the night it all began." A cold dread settled over me, and I wanted to turn back, to run, but my feet were glued to the ground, my gaze locked on the scarecrow. I could feel the whispers now louder, almost a chant, urging me to step closer, to look into the darkness beneath its hat. The rune carved into its chest seemed to pulse, a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart, and I knew, deep down, that I had to see, that whatever answers I sought lay within that void, within the hollow gaze of the scarecrow. Eliza turned to me, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror and something else, resignation. "There is no escaping it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Once you've seen it, once you've been marked, it's always with you." She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the scarecrow's chest, her fingers tracing the outline of the rune. The air around us seemed to shift, the temperature dropping suddenly, and I felt a chill spread through me, deeper than anything I had ever felt before. The scarecrow's head moved, its hollow gaze shifting, turning towards me, and in that moment, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. And then, I saw it. The darkness beneath the hat expanded, growing, enveloping everything around me. I was no longer standing in the field. I was back in the fire, the flames roaring around me, the air thick with smoke, and the screams of those who had perished. I could see them now, the figures from my dream, their faces twisted in pain, their mouths open in silent screams. The scarecrow stood at the center of it all, its arms raised, the rune on its chest glowing brightly, and I understood. This was no ordinary scarecrow. It was a vessel, a conduit for the suffering of those who had been lost, their souls bound to the field, forever trapped in the flames. The realization hit me like a blow, and I felt the ground give way beneath me, the flames surging up, wrapping around me, pulling me down. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, my voice lost in the roar of the fire. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Eliza, her eyes filled with tears, her mouth forming a single word: "Run." And then everything went black. I awoke on the edge of the field, my body aching, my hands covered in ash. The sun was rising, the sky a dull gray, and the field was empty, silent. Eliza was gone, the scarecrow nowhere to be seen, but the whispers were still there, faint but persistent, echoing in the back of my mind. I knew now that there was no escaping it, that the field had marked me, that it would always be with me, waiting for the moment when I would return. The scarecrow, the fire, the endless suffering, they were all a part of me now, and there was no running from it. The darkness had taken hold, and the descent had only just begun. The days after my return from the field felt like I was living on borrowed time. The whispers had grown stronger, more insistent, and the shadows around me seemed to move with a life of their own, creeping closer each night. The fear was constant, a knot in my chest that never loosened, and I knew that whatever haunted me was far from over. I could no longer ignore the pull. The urge to return to the field, to confront whatever had marked me, was overwhelming. The scarecrow, the flames, the whispers, they were calling me back, demanding that I face what had been set in motion. One cold, moonless night, I found myself unable to resist any longer. I left my house, the weight of the whispers pushing me forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The drive to the field felt like a journey to another world. The air was thick with tension, as if the universe itself held its breath. The sky above was black, no stars, no moon, just an endless, empty void that seemed to mirror the darkness within me. As I stepped out of the car, the cold wind bit at my skin, carrying with it the familiar scent of ash and decay, a reminder of the nightmare I was about to face. I walked into the field, each step feeling like a step closer to an inevitable doom. The earth was as brittle as before, the same crackling beneath my feet, and the air felt heavier with each breath. The deeper I ventured, the more I felt the presence, an oppressive, malevolent force that seemed to watch from every direction. The scarecrow was there, waiting, its silhouette barely visible in the dark, but its presence unmistakable. It stood at the center of the clearing, its head lowered, the rune on its chest glowing faintly, as if it was alive, pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging me forward, demanding that I look into the scarecrow's eyes. I could feel my body moving on its own, my legs carrying me closer, my hands trembling as they reached out towards the twisted figure. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the ground beneath me shifting, almost as if it was breathing, and I knew that I was no longer in control. I was a puppet, a vessel being drawn into something far beyond my comprehension. Suddenly, the scarecrow's head snapped up, and I was met with the darkness of its face, two empty voids where eyes should have been, staring directly into mine. The rune on its chest flared brightly, a blinding light that forced me to shield my eyes, and then I saw them, visions, images flashing before me. I saw the night of the fire, the villagers fleeing in terror, the flames consuming everything in their path. I saw figures, their faces twisted in agony, reaching out towards me, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow and empty. They were trapped, bound to the field, their souls never able to escape. The scarecrow moved, its wooden arms creaking as they rose, pointing towards something behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and there, emerging from the shadows, were the figures I had seen in my dreams, the ones engulfed in flames, their bodies charred and twisted, yet somehow still alive. They moved towards me, their hollow eyes fixed on mine, their mouths whispering words I could not understand, but that filled me with a deep, unshakable dread. They were the souls of those lost to the fire, bound to the field, and they had been waiting for me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I felt a pressure in my head, as if my skull was about to burst. The scarecrow stepped forward, its hollow gaze never leaving mine, and I understood. It was not just a scarecrow, it was a vessel for their suffering, the anchor that kept the souls bound to the field. The rune carved into its chest was a mark of their pain, a symbol of the curse that had trapped them, and now it had chosen me. I could feel the coldness spreading through me, the darkness seeping into my skin, and I knew that if I didn't do something, I would become one of them, another lost soul bound to the endless agony of the field. Desperation took hold, and I reached out, my fingers brushing against the glowing rune. The air around me seemed to explode, the whispers turning into a deafening roar, the ground shaking beneath me. The scarecrow's form began to crumble, the wood splintering, the cloth tearing away in the howling wind, and the figures in the flames screamed, a sound that pierced through me, a sound of pure, unending suffering. The rune burned beneath my hand, the light searing into my flesh, and I felt something break, a shattering deep within me, as if I had severed a connection that should never have been made. The light vanished, and I was thrown back, hitting the ground hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. The clearing was silent, the figures gone, the scarecrow reduced to a pile of ashes at my feet. The air was still, the sky above a deep, endless black, and I lay there, gasping for breath, my body aching, the coldness slowly fading from my bones. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I had broken the curse, that I was free. But then, in the silence, I heard it, a single whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the ashes at my feet. I looked down, my heart pounding, and saw the rune, still glowing faintly, etched into the dirt where the scarecrow had stood. The realization hit me like a blow, and I felt a chill spread through me. The curse was not broken. The field was not finished with me. The scarecrow had been a vessel, but the darkness, the suffering, it was still there, still waiting, and now it had found a new anchor, me. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of smoke, and I knew that this was only the beginning. The field had claimed me, and I could never escape. The whispers would never stop, the shadows would never leave, and the darkness would always be there, waiting, watching. I was bound to the field, just like the others, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, it would always find me. I stood, my body trembling, and turned away from the clearing, the whispers following me as I walked back to my car. The road ahead was dark, the sky above an endless void, and I knew that the nightmare was far from over. The burning field, the scarecrow, the endless suffering, they were all a part of me now, and the final confrontation was yet to come. The field had marked me, and it would never let me go. After that night, nothing was ever the same. I returned home, but it no longer felt like a place of safety. It felt like a waiting room, a temporary refuge before the inevitable return to that cursed field. I could feel the darkness lingering in the corners, the air heavy with something unseen. The whispers never truly left. They were softer now, like distant echoes, but always there, never ceasing, a constant reminder that the field still had its hold on me. I tried to live normally, but the feeling of being watched never left. It followed me into every room, clung to me in every shadow, a silent presence that turned my own home into a stranger. One night, as I tried to sleep, I felt a pressure against my chest, an invisible weight that made it impossible to breathe. My eyes snapped open, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was the figure I feared most, the scarecrow, no longer in its place at the center of the field, but here in my room. Its head hung low, the brim of its hat casting a shadow over its face, the faint glow of the rune barely visible. My heart pounded in my ears, and I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my body frozen under the weight of its presence, my voice caught in my throat. The scarecrow slowly raised its head, and I was met with the darkness of its gaze, two hollow voids staring back at me. And in that moment, I understood. It had not come to haunt me. It had come to claim me. It was as if all of the fear and the darkness had coalesced into this one moment, this one presence that was no longer content to merely watch from the shadows. It wanted me to follow it, to return to where it all began. And then, without a word, it turned, the door to my bedroom opening on its own, and I knew what it was telling me. It was time. I followed it, my body moving without my consent, my feet carrying me down the stairs and out into the night. The air was cold, the sky above filled with swirling clouds that seemed to form unnatural shapes, faces, twisted and screaming, a reflection of the fear that had taken root deep inside me. The scarecrow moved ahead of me, its form flickering in and out of existence, almost as if it were a shadow of something far worse. And then we reached the field. It was exactly as it had always been, dark, endless, the ground cracked and charred, air heavy with the stench of burning. The scarecrow led me to the center, where the rune was carved into the earth, still glowing with that same faint, eerie light. I could feel the ground pulsing beneath my feet, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, and I knew that this was the moment of truth. The scarecrow turned towards me, its hollow gaze fixed on mine, and it raised one hand, pointing to the rune. I understood what it wanted. I had to step into the symbol, had to give myself to whatever force it represented. As I stepped forward, the ground seemed to come alive, shifting and writhing beneath me, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar, the voices overlapping, shouting, screaming. I could feel the heat of the flames, see the figures emerging from the shadows, their bodies twisted, their faces filled with an unending agony. The scarecrow watched, its presence cold and unmoving, and I knew that there was no escaping this. I was bound to the field, to the darkness that lay within it, and now it was time to confront whatever waited on the other side. I stepped into the ruin, and everything changed. The earth gave way beneath me, and I felt myself falling, the darkness closing in from all sides, the air turning to fire in my lungs. I could see the figures now, reaching out towards me, their hands clawing at my skin, their eyes empty, hollow, desperate. The flames roared, consuming everything, and the last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the scarecrow, its head tilted, as if watching, as if waiting for me to become one of them. And then nothing. Silence. A deep, empty void that seemed to stretch on forever. I awoke in a hospital, the bright lights above blinding, the sound of voices muffled, distant. I could hear doctors speaking, but their words made no sense. My body ached, my skin felt cold, and I could still feel the faint echo of the whispers, like a memory that refused to fade. They told me I was found at the edge of the field, unconscious, with no signs of injury. But I knew the truth. I was not free. The field had not let me go. It had merely allowed me to leave for now. Since that night, I have felt it. Something lingering, watching, always just out of sight. The scarecrow, the rune, the endless flames. They haunt my dreams, but I know they are more than just nightmares. The darkness is still there, waiting, and I can feel its pull, growing stronger each day. The field is calling me back, and I know that one day I will have to answer. One day I will have to return, and when I do, I may not be able to leave again. So now I ask you, do you believe in the power of the unknown? Do you think that some places are cursed, marked by something beyond our understanding, something that refuses to be forgotten? If you have ever felt the presence of something watching, something following, then you understand the fear that grips me every night. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your theories, and share this story. Because sometimes the places we fear the most are not just stories, they are real, and they are waiting for us to make the wrong move. And you ever find yourself standing before a door that shouldn't be there, a door that seems to call your name? Remember my story and think carefully before you decide to open it. Because once you do, there may be no turning back.